Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, Episode 93, The Battle of Borodino. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners that if you'd like to donate to the show and help us grow, please go to patreon.com/generalsandnapoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify and give us a follow. As always, we appreciate your support. Now, on with the show. We have a very special guest on the line with us today, a good friend, Joe Failla. Say hello, Joe.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for joining us on the podcast. Joe is actually an author. He has a very interesting book that we're going to talk about in just a minute, but he has a fiction book called I, Dedicon that we're going to roll into in a minute. But we're also, before we get into all that, what is our topic for today, Joe?
The topic is the Battle of Borodino.
That's right. And this was an epic confrontation of titans between Napoleon's army and Russia. And it was the bloodiest single day of battle in the Napoleonic Wars. Why do you think it was such a grisly battle?
Well, there are a lot of factors. The battlefield was a big factor. It was a relatively narrow and flat area, interspersed with ravines, marshes, streams, hills, and depressions. And all that stifled the infantry and the cavalry as it advanced. The enemies were very close at hand. They could be from up to 100 yards to as little as face-to-face and hand-to-hand. So the battle consisted of frontal attacks against well-defended earthworks, and they were built by the Russians. They were known as redoubts. For example, the Great Redoubt of the Russian artillery commander Raevsky was built 20 feet high on an already high hill. The villages and the houses around it were destroyed, and all that rubble was used to build it. It was a V shape of 120 degrees. It pointed west toward the French in the Russian center of their line.
Okay.
Each limb was 80 yards long, and it was fronted by a 10-foot deep and 130-foot ditch. The Russians also dug what were known as wolf pits, which were thick holes in the ground. They put them in a checkerboard pattern in front of the ditch, and then in front of the ditch was a stream. That was fordable, but it was still a little bit of a barrier.
Yeah.
On top of the redoubt was 20 cannons, 8,000 infantry, and they shot through battlements. So you can imagine as being a single guy running up the hill or a horse, you already, without even being shot at, were going to probably wind up being terribly wounded.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, just the layout of the battlefield, the two forces involved. Yeah, and we'll dive into it here in just a minute. Before we do that, though, can you give us a brief overview of your book? Because I'd like my listeners to check it out either on Amazon or Kindle or wherever books are sold. What is it about this book that might interest my listeners?
Well, I wrote this story based on my interests. I always, from being a young kid, would read all the classic French authors like Balzac and Dumas, Hugo. I would always look for adventures. And of course, they dealt a ton with the Napoleonic era. It was a very heroic time. There was a lot of splendor and magnificence. And they, built it up in my mind. And so I was always interested in that. And then I learned French. I studied it in high school. I did a minor in college. And then I lived there for a while, did some time in college and medical school. And I worked there as a surgeon, too. And so I learned French, and then I thought, something, I know about all these terrible wounds as a hand and orthopedic surgeon. And then I thought, I know all about the Napoleonic era, so I can put the two together. And what I did was I made really like a romance, like a love story with a backdrop of Napoleonic times. Mm-hmm. I kind of thought of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So I think of Napoleon as the king, and then all his marshals and generals were sort of the Knights of the Round Table. Right. So he interacted with them. Right. And the way I made them part of the story was the main character is a modern day military surgeon. He's not me because I was never in the military. But what this surgeon has happened to him is he's affected by this problem where he has dreams. And the dreams include scenes of Napoleonic battle. And he comes to realize the only way this can happen is if he inherited the memories of an ancestor who actually fought in those battles. So the other main character is his great-great-great-grandfather, who was the intelligence chief for Napoleon's army and Napoleon's main confidant. So I have the story run through the relationship between Napoleon and his generals and all the battles he did, and then the life of that ancient ancestor and who he fell in love with, and how sort of the past can come back to the present, and how loyalty and love, forces like that, can endure all the way through time.
I love it. That sounds fascinating, and we'll come back to that at the end of the episode because it does sound like an intriguing book. But yeah, let's dive into the battle, and we'll come back to that because I want to incorporate that here with the battle.
Sure.
Let's get into the background of Borodino and how we get there. In June 1812, Napoleon launches his invasion of Russia on the pretext that Czar Alexander wasn't adhering to the continental system, which forbade Europe from trading with the British. Why do you think Napoleon actually said, all right, I'm going to cross that Rubicon and go to war with Russia?
Well, there are many historical reasons that people cite, and, breaking the continental system was one of them. It really annoyed Napoleon. But actually, if you read about it, he himself broke the continental system. He smuggled things from England, especially gold, which he needed to pay his troops with. So he would trade brandy and wine and other French products. They had a system where they would bring things to America, offload them, and then bring them back. So they tried, he himself was breaking it. And that kind of annoyed Czar Alexander I. Also, the two of those guys were really equals, and they were, struggling for domination of Europe and for everybody's attention. And, it's funny, you could cite lots of little things like the failure of diplomacy of let's say, Talleyrand and Metternich and all the statesmen of those times. Also, they always talk about the Duchy of Oldenburg. That was in Germany. Yep. And Tsar's Alexander's sister married the Duke, and then Napoleon took away the duchy from him. So that was sort of another slight to Alexander. But I don't think it was any of those small things. I think it was more of the big picture. It was more of a personal issue. There was this inexorable movement of Napoleon trying to, fulfill his plans for Europe. He looked at Europe as a huge military map puzzle, and he was filling it in little by little. And he started around France in the center, but he never really got to fill in the corners. So the left corner would be Spain, and he got thwarted there. And it was really a proxy war with the British. The top left corner was England, and he couldn't fill that one in. So he went to the center and gradually went east in Europe. And then he finally had Russia as the last giant piece. And I think he just had to try to get that done. So I think that people talk about it being the great struggle of the Ancien Regime in France after the Revolution, and the old monarchy going after the new, fighting the new revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment, and Napoleon jumped on those. But I really think it was sort of a great denouement of like a Greek tragedy. Napoleon rose from very humble background to great heights, and then he gradually wound down and fell from those heights, and he could not stop himself.
There is something Shakespearean there. You have the great rise and then the great fall. So this was just the beginning of his fall. The early phases of the war was kind of a cat and mouse game, as Napoleon's huge army kept trying to force a decisive set-piece battle with the Russians, who kept withdrawing deeper into Russia. Do you think this was the right strategy by the Russians?
Yeah, I mean, that proved to be the right strategy. From the moment Napoleon entered Russia, his army started suffering losses. Many people think of all the privations of winter, but really the summer was the killer going in, and the winter was the killer going out. I mean, the temperatures bizarrely reached almost 100 degrees. There were clouds of dust everywhere, swarms of mosquitoes. And then all of a sudden, 4 days after going in, there was this torrential rain that turned all the dust to a deep mud that went up to people's chests. He couldn't pull any of the vehicles. The horses died. Also his plan, his MO, was in battles to live off the land, get in and out quick. So he really didn't have supply wagons to feed all the guys. So when he got there, he found out that the Russians burned all the silos in the villages. They trampled the farm fields. They poisoned the wells and the streams with, slaughtered livestock that were rotting.
Yep.
The French army was starving. There was typhoid, dehydration, dysentery. People were dying left and right. 25% of the horses died within a few days. It's just that it was not something he planned. He thought he'd get in and out in 3 weeks and he wouldn't have to worry about all those problems. But it turned out that was the right strategy. Though those factors killed more men than any bullets could have.
Well, he has a close victory finally at Smolensk when I think the two armies of I think it's Bagration and Deitoli unite. So he wins that battle, but it's not like an Austerlitz decisive victory. So he decides to press on to Moscow. Why do you think? Why is Moscow so important to the Russians at this time in history? Because the capital is St. Petersburg, but I think in Napoleon's, if I capture Moscow, they'll have to come to the negotiating table.
Right. I mean, Moscow was the second largest city. It was the cultural center. It was very important to the Russians because of the large population. It had a religious significance. The Orthodox Church was huge there, and everybody's seen, St. Basil's and the beautiful cathedral. So the city was beautiful. It was cultural. He describes coming down towards Moscow, and all the soldiers describe, a gleaming a city full of, sort of Asian domes that covered all the churches. It was an amazing place. I've never seen it. I would love to someday. Sure. But I think it was dazzling to them.
Yeah.
But it was not as important to Alexander as St. Petersburg. It was just amazing to Napoleon when he saw that the Russians were willing to burn it just to have him not be able to get it.
Yeah.
That totally blew his mind. He just didn't understand that whole tactic. He probably should have by then because it was already so deep in. But it totally took him by surprise. And also whenever he conquered a capital, he would then wait for the administrative elders of the city to come out and, offer to make peace. And then he would instantly sign a treaty. And he kind of did what the Romans did. He would say, okay, we conquered you. Now you can become Roman. And now you're one of us.
Right.
But the Russians didn't want to be one of him.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think it was an Imperial Guard soldier or officer who said, we've conquered Madrid and Lisbon and Berlin, and him saying, I've never seen a more beautiful city than Moscow. Just like you said, with the onion domes and all the glittering opulence of it. So I'm sure it's a beautiful city, but I think that's why we have this big stand at Borodino, because the Russians basically drew a line in the sand. And Deitoli, the Russian commander, was replaced by Kutuzov. Do you know what the size of the opposing armies were at this time? Because I know Napoleon's army had whittled down by this time.
Oh yeah, I mean, the French had about 125,000 men, 28,000 cavalry, and 500 and some guns. The Russians had almost eerily similar numbers: 130,000 men, 25,000 cavalry, but they had more than 600 guns. Napoleon, I bet, found that pretty ironic that he started with 500 and something men, and now he's down to almost an even match.
Yeah, and just so we're clear, not all of them died on the march. He left some in garrisons and behind him. And well, let's talk strategy. Marshal Davout, one of Napoleon's best, suggests a flanking maneuver on the prepared defensive positions, but Napoleon opts for a head-on assault. The Russians have set up, like you said at the beginning, a very strong defensive redoubts around the battlefield. Can you talk about these initial positions?
Yeah. It's if you've ever read War and Peace, Tolstoy makes the Battle of Borodino, a huge part of part 3 of his book. And he pointed out that the Russian line was originally centered on the high road between Smolensk and Moscow. And the reason they did that is because that's where they anticipated the French army was going to march at them, which was very reasonable. But right before Borodino, Napoleon, for some reason, nobody's explained why, decided to turn right, cross the road. He went south of the road, and then he crossed the river that was parallel to the road, the Kalacha River.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, he's in the middle of this field, and he sees this giant fort on top of the hill, and it was at the town of Shevardino. So he's looking south and southeast, and he's saying, oh, that must be the Russian center, and that's where we got to attack. So that's what led to the Battle of Smolensk. But when you look at the way the Russian line was set up, all of a sudden, they were oriented much farther north in a town called Novoe, and then down towards the road that we mentioned before, and then a little south of that. But now they're forced to have their line go way south, and they didn't prepare for that. Mm-hmm. So their southern flank was relatively unprotected. So the Russian general Bagration, he had to rapidly build some earthworks right south of this village of Semenovskaya. And they were called the Flèche because Flèche in French means arrowhead. Mm-hmm. So these were arrow-shaped redoubts, earth forts that were quickly thrown up. They were essentially just put on small hills, and there were a bunch of pike poles sharpened, like you would see in all more ancient warfare. Mm-hmm. And then he put his artillery on top of them, and cannons and a bunch of infantry. But the thing is, Napoleon already in his mind, I think, felt, hey, we're already flanking the Russians to their left because they didn't plan us to go this way. But he didn't go south enough. I think his decision, like you said, John, was we're going to take this thing straight on and hit this heavily enforced position, which was almost one of his precepts. I mean, what Napoleon did in his battles, he won in three ways. Mm-hmm. He hit with cannon the weakest spots, soften them up. And then he would send in a whole wall of steel, men on horses, the cavalry, to try to beat them up even more. And the final blow, he'd send in his reserves, fresh guys, to finish them off and chase them away. So that becomes an issue later when he decides not to use the guard. But that's pretty much the thing. The Russians were thrown off because Napoleon, for some reason, decided to turn right, and now he's facing their weakest spot.
Yeah, it's interesting. You wonder too if his soldiers were just exhausted. Napoleon's like, we don't have the energy or time for a flanking maneuver. These guys are on their last leg. Let's just go right at them.
Right.
The first action is the Battle of Borodino, which turns into basically a bloodbath precursor. Marshal Murat and the Russians engaged in a massive cavalry clash. Do you know what the casualties of this initial onslaught were? I know the French win it, but it's pretty bloody.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the one side against the other, the French had 10,000 cavalry, the Russian had 4,000. Mm-hmm. The French had 180 guns, the Russians only had 35. Mm-hmm. So they were outmatched. I mean, the infantry with 30,000 guys against 8,000 Russians. So it was really tough. But the Russians were dug in. It was brutal. They were shooting at the infantry marching uphill. Mm-hmm. So they were sending grape shot at these guys, which is essentially a huge shotgun blast from a cannon. There was a ton of hand-to-hand combat. So the Russians lost 6,000 men. The French lost 4,000. And that wasn't even a major battle yet, which is, it just shows you how terrible this warfare was. It was just, deadly.
Yeah. And that's, you just say those numbers, but compared to some of the earlier wars or battles in the Revolutionary, those were the whole day's casualty numbers. And that was just for Borodino. So from there, the main Battle of Borodino begins 2 days later on September 7th.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
This episode is brought to you by Vital Farms. Vital Farms is keeping it bullshit-free. Pasture-raised eggs means their hens enjoy outdoor access year-round while foraging on a buffet of local grasses. You can even find the farm name of where the eggs were laid on the side of each carton. Vital Farms knows you'll taste the difference of eggs made with fresh air and sunshine. Look for the black carton at the grocery store and learn more at vitalfarms.com.
The assault begins with 102 French cannons firing at the Russian center, and an assault on General Bagration's flèches or arrow-shaped earthworks. What's happening around the field? Can you give us kind of a bird's eye view?
Yeah, sure. And I think that bird's eye view is important. I would encourage your readers to do just a Google map search of the village of Borodino and put in village of Borodino to the National War and History Museum, because the museum is centered on what was the Great Redoubt. And you'll see it was about 0.7 of a mile. So imagine you can walk that in 15 minutes. You can run it in a lot quicker. And so think of it, maybe think of it as like a half a mile. And so 10 city blocks, all this fighting took place in that narrow zone with, weapons bristling at each other and guys close together. So if you think of Napoleon at 3 a.m. on September 7th, so 3 hours before that cannonade started, he's riding up and down the battlefield with his marshals, and he's looking, and he has to decide what he's going to do. So he said, okay, we're going to do 4 things. We're going to attack the flèches at 6 a.m. Those are the southernmost redoubts.
Right.
The problem was that his cannons were too far back. He initially positioned them out of range, so then he had to suddenly move them up closer under Russian cannon fire. So that was a huge problem. Poniatowski, who was the head of the Polish Lancers to the south, he told him to go through the woods and then go towards the southern end of their line at the village of Utitsa. But he was stopped by General Tuchkov as soon as he came out of those woods. The third thing he told was Kompans with his infantry to go through the woods to the south and then attack the southernmost of the 3 flèches. Well, as soon as he came out of the woods, he was hit by canister shot, and 8,000 French people immediately died. The last thing was Prince Eugene. He was going to take Borodino to the north. So and then after he tried to do that, he was supposed to attack the Great Redoubt. But as soon as he got across the river, and after he took Borodino, the Russian generals pushed him back. So now he's waiting to attack the Great Redoubt. So the 4 things that Napoleon tried to do as his plan got thwarted immediately. And now you've got a battlefield full of smoke and dust, and nobody can see what's going on. It's sort of like that ball where you really can't tell anything. It's a ballroom full of smoke. So, what does he do? The most severe fighting, though, was against the Flèche in the south. There were multiple French infantry and cavalry assaults by Davout and Ney, and they were repelled by Bagration. His cavalry pursued the French after that. There were more attacks then by Rapp, Desaix, Junot, and Ledru. So there were 40,000 French infantry and 200 cannons. The French eventually got past the 2 flèches, but as soon as they did, they had the third one in the back. And a flèche, like you noticed, is V-shaped. It's open in the back. Right. So the third flèche had a bunch of cannons who started firing on the French at the front 2 flèches. Right. They annihilated them. So, they were gunned down with a lot of counterattacks. The description was the French climbed over mountains of dead and wounded soldiers, theirs and the Russians. The flèches were taken and lost about 7 times. So, it was just brutal. And then the Russians were reinforced from their north right side of their line, which never really took part in the battle because Napoleon had turned south. So, it kept on going and going and going, and more people were dying and more people were dying. And, finally it got to the point where the French were able to, get over and get all the flèches. And that's when Marshal Ney saw that they were retreating in disorder. The Russians were going north and east. And he said at that point, we got to let Napoleon know that if we can get some fresh guys and pursue them, we can finish them off.
I know he gets many requests for the Imperial Guard to be unleashed, but before we get to that, you can usually tell how bloody a battle is if a lot of generals and marshals are getting killed and wounded, because when your line's cracking, the general has to run up and say, hey, hang in there, guys, let's go forward.
Right.
And many of the marshals are wounded in the melee, including Marshal Davout, who has his horse shot out from under him. He lands so hard that General Sorbier reports him as dead. And there's other pivotal figures wounded or killed. I want to talk about that, and I want you also to talk about medical care during this battle, because I know it was, medical care in this age is lackluster at best, but with no supplies, everyone's exhausted. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, what happened was it still starts with the beginning of the campaign as they crossed into Russia and after the battle at Smolensk. So the medical supplies were pretty much abandoned in favor of the cannons. Napoleon had no choice. He only had a few carts and horses to pull them. So they left the medical stuff behind. Mm-hmm. So with all the wounds that occurred, the only material they had were ripped up bandages from old uniforms, mm-hmm. Bloodied already. They had to use cannon plugs and gun cotton for bandages. Mm-hmm. The makeshift hospital was put up at the Borodino archive building. So what they used was rolled up documents as splints to hold, broken legs and arms together. Yeah. All amputees, they died from shock, blood loss, infection, gangrene. And it's estimated that Dr. Larrey, who was the chief surgeon, he did 200 amputations that first day by himself. Yeah. He also invented what he called flying ambulances. They were small carts pulled by a horse that would go onto the battlefield, evacuate the wounded. But there were none of them at this battle. They just never made it there. There were no operating rooms. If you needed light wherever you operated, you only had a candle instead of the lamps that they used. Yeah. There were no beds. So if you operated on somebody, they wound up on bare ground. There were only 45 surgeons. They needed at least 100 more. Yeah. So a lot of these people wound up dying. And then, they were left in the Russians' hands. So who knows what happened to them.
So if you were wounded, you were pretty much, if you were seriously wounded, it was like a death sentence at this battle.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. Well, back to the flèches. The French launched 7 different assaults, and all were beaten back in close combat. Bagration's army fell apart once he was wounded and removed from the field, and he eventually dies. In the meantime, what's happening in Prince Eugene's sector?
Well, at the same time, keeping it in perspective, it's like they're attacking on several fronts at the same time. So with that huge cannonade at 6 a.m., they not only hit the flèches, but they also hit the Great Redoubt, mm-hmm. which was just like a small half a kilometer or a kilometer or so to the north. So it's a whole different area, but still very close. So mm-hmm. the Great Redoubt was attacked. Eugene took Borodino, but when he was chased back, he then had to reposition his cannons to shoot towards the Great Redoubt. He was shooting in a southeasterly direction to hit it. They had to clear the Russians out of the ravine that was before the Great Redoubt. There was all sorts of shrubbery and bushes and low trees, and the Russian skirmishers were hiding in there. So before the infantry and cavalry even got a charge going, they were being shot at. So he had to clear them out. Ney also joined in with some of his forces. His forces attacked not only the Flèche, but he participated, in the Redoubt attack. Mm-hmm. So the French infantry, as soon as they ran up, imagine guys in columns of 3 or 4 across deep, just mowed down by that canister shot from the cannons, huge shotgun blasts. The infantry were in those tight columns. The cavalry were already hampered by the terrain and the dead bodies of horses and men they were trying to get over. Napoleon's right-hand man, Marshal Caulaincourt, said in his memoirs, "The Great Redoubt belched out a veritable hell at our center." So you can imagine just all that gunfire. And, it's metal against flesh. Yeah. The French attacked continually, and they finally got into the redoubt at 10 a.m. There was a huge amount of hand-to-hand combat. The guys shooting the cannons, the Russians, they didn't have weapons. They took out their cannon spikes and their ramrods and fought with those. And eventually all the Russian gunners were killed. Yeah. The bodies were described as heaps 6 feet high.
Yeah. General de Tolly on the Russian side called it a walk through hell. That's a quote. Yes. What were the commanders doing, Kutuzov and Napoleon?
Raevsky was one of the generals, and he was right there on the scene. Mm. And he said that, afterwards, that if the French cavalry had been supported just a little more at that moment, the Russian center would have collapsed and the battle would have ended at 10 a.m. Mm-hmm. But there's no way Napoleon could have known that. He was back at his headquarters at the Shevardino Redoubt about a mile away. He could see, but with this cannon smoke, you don't see past 600 to 800 yards. Right. Everything is just a wall of obscured smoke. So, Eugene's artillery was, pounding the Russian positions. Barclay was fighting him. Napoleon, they say, was in his headquarters, and that he had a cold and a fever, and he was not feeling well. But I don't know, maybe he had some of those things, but he was a pretty tough guy.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't be able to ride up and down the line at 3 a.m. if he was that sick 3 hours, later.
True.
I think that he was just watching it all. He was very worried about the outcome. There was not much he could do in the chaos but wait and see if the plans we talked about before could be carried out. Now, Kutuzov, on the other hand, was even farther away.
Yeah.
He was up in the north and the east in Gorky. He never saw what was happening. He was not at the battle. He just received updates. His style was to stay calm and approve what his commanders on the battlefield suggested. They would come up to him and he'd say, "Yep, do it." And it was mainly send reinforcements down to the south.
This episode is brought to you by Mug Root Beer. It's 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Too late for a coffee, too early for a beer. So you walk around aimlessly in search of a mysterious third beverage. That's when you hear it. The sound of the dog. The sound of Mug Root Beer. So drink Mug Root Beer if you got that dog in you.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. Kutuzov was described as being in a daze or trance by Colonel Clausewitz, and that his artillery was poorly positioned. So, yeah, neither commander had their best day. And, yeah, I don't know if it was the fog of war or, like you said, unless you're on the scene like Ney and Murat were, you couldn't do anything about it. Like, they were too far back to make any difference.
That's right.
As we touched on before, around midday, Napoleon receives numerous requests from all the marshals and Prince Eugene to release the famed Imperial Guard to finish off the Russians. However, Napoleon steadfastly refuses to release the Guard. Do you think this was the right decision?
Well, yeah, people debate that like crazy. That Russian cavalry charge, it was 8,000, and it was filled with Cossacks. And they flanked Eugene. They went north and to the right, which was the left of the French line. They went behind Eugene, but all they did was harass him because immediately the French formed squares and countered the cavalry, and also the guns just mowed down all their cavalry.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a very effective attack physically, but it had a tremendous emotional impact, they say, on Napoleon, because at that point, he never could conceive of the fact that the Russians could mass a counterattack of that size after what he had done to the Great Redoubt. He thought there's been so much death and destruction that they would never be able to attack. And you know something? He was probably right, because the Russians were deployed in multiple lines, very deep to the east, with about 100 paces between each line. So one line of Russian infantry would be mowed down. The next one would stand up. And that just kept on happening hour after hour. So he was afraid that if he sent in his final reserves, because the Guard was all that was left, it was 11,000 men. If he sent them in, he'd have nothing left to fight the next day and nothing left to get out. But, in the end, maybe he should have sent them in, because he lost them anyway in the retreat.
Yeah, it's a little bit of Monday morning armchair quarterbacking, because we have the benefit of hindsight. We know what happened. Napoleon had no idea, like, hey, I may need these guys 2 weeks down the road. And he did. He needed them to basically get out of Russia on the retreat. So could he have finished off the Russian army? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they would have been still alive to fight another day and he would have had no reserve. So I don't know. I think he made the right decision, but it's, like you said, it's hotly debated.
Right. You know what? Napoleon would say, one of my favorite quotes is, "From the sublime to the ridiculous in one small step."
Yep.
There's the infantryman who's waving his flag, and all of a sudden 5,000 guys see him and they run up the hill behind him. There's the lone private who winds up shooting the opposing general in the heart. All these things can change the battle.
Yeah.
And you could have had a few more cavalry go up, but there's no way to know that, in the heat of battle. It just didn't happen.
Yeah.
And we now know the outcome. But one interesting perspective is that if you read Marshal Caulaincourt's memoirs called Napoleon in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about this. He says that, the marshals did meet with Napoleon, but the consensus was that it wouldn't be worth it to send in the guard. So it wasn't only him. There were a bunch of good minds who decided against it too.
Right. Well, there's one other area we touched on earlier that I want to wrap up on, Utitsa, where Polish Prince Poniatowski, who becomes a French marshal later, is leading assaults on the southern flank of the Russian line. What's happening down there?
Well, Poniatowski was one of the original 4 orders. Napoleon wanted him to go way south of the flèches, mm-hmm. while the infantry was attacking the flèches, and he wanted to attack the Russian General Tuchkov and push him back, and then he wanted Poniatowski to then come north behind the flèches. But, that never really happened. Ney backed him up. Murat famously backed him up, and they pushed the Russians east, but then the Russians counterattacked. And there's the scene they talk about where, Murat is in the middle of a French square, resisting the Russians. And all the Cossacks basically stopped fighting and just stared at him because they were so amazed he was such a legendary figure.
Yeah.
But, so you could see there was a lot of resistance. So Poniatowski, even though he fought that battle and eventually took Utitsa, it was too late to strike north and go, with Ney to hit the Russian rear because he didn't have the cavalry to do it.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, we're talking about stacks of dead bodies, 6 high, and the battle dies down and the Russians pull back. Do you know when the Russians retired from the field?
Well, it turned out that after the French finally got the Great Redoubt, which was towards like 3 or 4 o'clock, there was sporadic fighting. There was a few counterattacks, but the cannonade just died down on both sides, and eventually the Russians just retreated to the east and regrouped. And there was one Russian general, I can't remember who it was, who said that at that point, at about that time, at 3 or 4 o'clock, they were waiting for the French coup de grace, but it never came. Mm-hmm. And, maybe that was the unsent cavalry, the unsent guard, but I think at that point, the way they described this was after, it wasn't 12 hours yet, it started at 6 and ended at 6. Mm-hmm. So, you're almost there. You're at 9 or 10 hours of constant fighting. Mm-hmm. Everybody was so exhausted. The ammunition was all spent. Mm-hmm. Nobody had it in them to, do any more. So right about 5 to 6 p.m., it was pretty much done, and the Russians were just in a new defensive line, and the French didn't have any more to give.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a 15-round heavyweight boxing match right there.
Right.
And yeah, Kutuzov withdraws. He thinks about another battle in front of the walls of Moscow, but thinks better of it because he doesn't receive enough reinforcements or reserves. So he cedes Moscow to Napoleon's army, who occupies the city on September 14th. What were the final casualty estimates?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to average them out from all the sources I read, and the number I came up with was 35,000 French dead or wounded. So out of those 35,000, they say 10,000 were dead. But so many people died soon after that night or the next day. Mm-hmm. So I think going with 35,000 is a good number. That included 48 of the French generals.
Yeah.
With the Russians, there were 45,000 dead and wounded, so maybe 15,000 of that 45 were dead, and then soon after more of them died. And they had 22 generals that died.
Yeah.
I also read an estimate of 40,000 horses were killed.
Yeah.
So if you put that in perspective, imagine like if you go to Rome and you look at the Roman Colosseum, that held 50,000 people. So you have 2 Roman Colosseums filled with dead and wounded, and a third filled with dead horses.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just impossible for your mind to get around, all in 12 hours.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's tragic, and this is the big question, because it's the definition of a Pyrrhic victory. We're going to talk about the legacy here of this battle, but it's Pyrrhic because Napoleon wins the battle, in quotes, wins, but loses the Russian campaign, right? Like, is that the legacy of it, or is it just completely senseless and Napoleon should have just stopped in Smolensk?
Well, he should have never gone in. You know, the legacy is really, it's a treasure trove of important lessons that are still valuable today. You know, the main lesson is don't invade Russia. That's the first thing. You know, the military lessons are, of course, you know, have a purpose. You know, an aimless war can't be won. It can't be based on a grudge or personal reasons. You know, you have to consider the logistics, the terrain, the enemy's strategy, their strengths, the weaknesses, their motivation. And the Russians had incredible motivation. They're fighting people on their own home turf. And they had, you know, they had nothing to lose. They had to fight. You know, also have an exit strategy. We always talk about that with our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, when you build a huge army, you're likely to use it, especially if it's right next to another huge army. That's another lesson. You know, if you're a leader, you have to consider the welfare of those you lead. There was so much death and destruction. You need to have good advisors, listen to them. You know, Napoleon said famously, the Russian campaign was a choice between dishonor and war. Well, was it really? You know, in the end, wasn't it more dishonorable to lose your entire army? And I just think he didn't think about that. You know, there's other smaller lessons like don't make enemies because they have long memories. You know, don't believe your own propaganda. Don't make decisions based on emotion, ego, anger, revenge. Those cloud your judgment. And also, you know, we talk about this so much today. Does the end justify the means? Use diplomacy. You know, sometimes gentle persuasion is a little better than blunt force. You know, that's probably always a good lesson to remember before a war. And, you know, as a surgeon, there's another thing called a timeout. And what that is, John, is right before you're about to cut, the nurse says, hey, Dr. Failla, this is so-and-so, the patient. This is the operation you're going to do. We're working on the right arm. Is that the correct one? It's the final chance to make sure you're not going to operate on the wrong patient and on the wrong side and do the wrong operation. So, you know, it's kind of like waiting a day before sending an angry email. You know, Napoleon should have just chilled a little bit, maybe found other ways to do this, and he wouldn't have lost his army. Who knows what would have happened? Europe would have been totally different. Our whole world would have been totally different.
Right. And I think you mentioned how many generals died. You know, how many talented junior officers probably died, you know, captains and colonels that he couldn't replace. General Caulaincourt's brother died at Borodino. You know, after that, you know, I know he rallies a little bit in 1813, 1814, but the legacies are many. And it definitely shouldn't, it wasn't about that he should have fought. You're right. No. But all right. Good stuff. Loved all that. Thank you for that. I do want to talk about the book again. I Det to Con, and it's spelled EIDETICON, correct?
Yes, and that word, I invented that word. You know, I figured it'd be good to have a unique word for your book. So eidetic memory, EIDETIC, that's pictorial memory. So when somebody has a photographic memory, that's the kind of memory they have. If you show somebody with eidetic memory a huge map and say, all right, tell me what city is where, and, you know, and the distance, they'll be able to just close their eyes and picture the map and almost read it off like they're looking at it. So the characters in this book have eidetic photographic memory. So the word icon, you know, it's like on an icon on your computer, but it's also a famous person or a symbol. So it's really a hybrid word that means symbol of memory. So what happens during the story is the characters see things from Napoleonic times, like weapons, paintings that were, you know, in the various museums, and that evokes memories, eidetic memories of Napoleon's battles. So the main character, his name is Paul Flavel, he's an army surgeon. He gets affected by this, and he has to figure out, is he going nuts, or is he actually remembering things? So what he does is he makes a list of all the details, the terrain of the battlefield, the pistol he used in the battle with a certain etching on the silver plate on the muzzle, on the stock, and then he goes into the museum and he tries to figure out, are these things real? And he does find evidence that the things in his dream really existed. And then, of course, he finds people who are descendants of the other people in the battles of Napoleon. So he winds up basically running into his buddies from 200 years ago from the Napoleonic War, and then they all interact. He finds a woman who he falls in love with from those times. She's descended from his ancestor's girlfriend, but he also finds enemies who want to come after him still after 200 years. So the fight goes on.
I like the use of photographic memory too, because I've heard and read that not only did Napoleon have that, his chief of staff Marshal Berthier had that, and they could tell any soldier where he was supposed to be and what regiment and what time, and without looking at a map, and they just knew it. They just knew where all their soldiers and troops were supposed to be. So I think that's a clever tool in that book to have that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good stuff. So at Dedicon on Amazon or Kindle or wherever books are sold. And yeah, Joe, that was really, really good stuff. I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thank you, John. It was really a pleasure to be here and to share all this information and the love of the Napoleonic era.